What are you making, Izumi, of this latest emergency being imposed on Tokyo, and what are the likely, I guess, what's the likely impact on the economy there too?
Well, I think the short answer is that this is going to obviously be a near-term blow to the economy. I mean, if you look at the content of the proposed measures so far, they're largely focused on limiting business hours, after 8 p.m. for bars and restaurants. So it is less stringent than the previous state of emergency. But I think the downside risk that we're worried about is that the measures are not enough to control this third wave outbreak, and that ultimately the state of emergency has to be expanded and possibly extended beyond the current 1 month schedule.
So, I mean, this is happening now, but the point is this is also a pathogen which is now also spread outside of Tokyo, which it always had, but it's, I suppose, taking more and more prefectures into consideration for further emergency lockdowns. Are the Japanese authorities, in your view, doing enough?
Well, I think it's tough, but one thing we can say is that the government should be offering probably stronger support to businesses. The problem in Japan is that it's, from a legal perspective, Japan cannot impose the kinds of strict lockdowns that we see in Europe and the rest of the world. The government is trying to work on legislation that would change that. But it's not going to come soon enough for this current outbreak. So if the government is continuing to rely on these sorts of requests for voluntary, measures, but compliance is not going to be high if businesses feel that they cannot afford to limit their business. So I think the biggest thing we're focusing on right now is what kind of further fiscal support the government is going to offer, because that's going to be very important for the effectiveness of the state of emergency and also the recovery once the virus threat fades.
So are we looking possibly at a fourth stimulus package? And if we don't see that, how important would the budget be?
Well, I don't think you're looking at an immediate new stimulus package, and this is because as part of the latest stimulus package that the government finalized in December, it set aside a substantial amount of budget reserves, $5 trillion for the current fiscal year ending in March, and then another $5 trillion for the next fiscal year. So it actually has plenty of funds that it can tap into. It just needs to decide what to do with it and deploy it the sooner the better.
Do you expect the BOJ to play a bigger role, Izumi? And if so, what do you see the BOJ doing?
I think that the Bank of Japan will continue to operate kind of behind the scenes. It did a lot of monetary, stimulus and response in the early phase of this crisis. It's pretty much done everything it can except cut negative rates further, which we think is detrimental, actually, for the economy. So it's focused on continuing to support lending, which I think is very important, and it's going to continue to do. The board has scheduled a review of monetary policy, which it hopes to wrap up before the end of the March monetary policy meeting. But I think the changes stemming from that review are going to be quite operational in nature. And we're not looking at major policy changes for the Bank of Japan for a long time.
How closely do you think the BOJ and the government is looking at the yen, currently at near 9-month highs, and exporters are close to loss-making levels? At what stage, at what level, when do you see an intervention?
Well, I think the main concern for the government and Bank of Japan is to try to, avoid a disorderly and very speedy appreciation of the yen. If the appreciation of the yen is gradual, I think the impact on the economy is not going to be that large. And in fact, if you look at how the yen has performed against other countries, it hasn't appreciated as much. So that's why I think they'll be continue to vocalize concerns around market moves, but I don't think they are going to take any overaction, nor can they.
Let's have a look at the yen and what it's been doing. I mean, of course, it's really been bowing to the vicissitudes of what the dollar's been doing. And currently, we had it below the 103 level, strengthening. We've had it now weaken somewhat. What level is the Bank of Japan and the government of Japan comfortable with the yen, and what are your targets for it?
Yeah, I think at current levels it's fine. I think the main probably number that you're looking at is probably 100. If there's a threat that the dollar yen drops below 100, that's a very significant psychological sort of barrier. So I think you're going to see more verbal intervention by government authorities. But once again, it's about the speed of the move and also the context behind it.
No meaningful pickup in inflation so far, which means the BOJ's extreme easing stance will continue. What do you make of inflation?
Well, I think that very simply, I mean, it's interesting because inflation is a big topic globally, especially as it concerns the United States. There's some strong expectations among some investors now that the fiscal stimulus in the U.S. is going to lead to an acceleration, a pretty strong one in the U.S. In Japan, though, I don't think it's going to, that's really a risk here. If you look at inflation, if you look through the noise in the latest inflation numbers, it's kind of been hovering around zero, a little bit negative. I don't think it's going to break away from that range because consumers, the recovery in consumption, unfortunately for Japan, I think is going to be weak even after the vaccine rollout begins and the virus threat phase. And this is because of the prolonged sort of hit to sentiment that we can expect from this shock. So if consumer demand remains weak, I think price pressures will also remain quite low.